Good evening. My name is Ksenia McCoskey, and I am a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues here at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Crisis Over Ukraine, Causes and Consequences. Conflict in Ukraine is not a new topic to the world or the Clark Forum. In fact, our first panel on the issue dates back to 2005. Yet I, like many others, had not been following the situation in Ukraine closely prior to reports of an unusual Russian military movement at the end of 2021. Over winter break, I was visiting family in Delaware and attended the local Ukrainian Orthodox church. After church, the priest announced an initiative run by the Archdiocese to collect stuffed animals to send to children in the war-torn regions of Ukraine for Christmas. I knew little about the limited resources available to Ukrainian children, but it was clear to this parish that this conflict is personal, with many even having family and friends stuck in the crossfire. And while not much news at the time was then being published on the topic, it was clear that there was instability that the wider American public was not aware of. A few weeks ago, I was in the car listening to NPR when a story came on regarding a Ukrainian family living in Kyiv, stockpiling food, packing suitcases, and monitoring their amount of available gasoline. These brief, yet heartbreaking announcements and stories have reminded me of the human toll this conflict brings. The Global Conflict Tracker from the Council on Foreign Relations estimates that more than 13,000 people have died in Ukraine due to conflict with Russia, and 1.5 million citizens have been internally displaced. Even though the situation might be discussed like a strategic game of militarized chess, there are thousands of lives at stake. Historical connections between Ukraine and Russia date back to the 9th century, and up until the fall of the USSR in 1991, Ukraine was a key region of agriculture and economics for the Soviet Union. Even though the two countries have since separated, Russian leaders, such as President Vladimir Putin, have directly expressed the belief that Ukrainians and Russians are one people and always have been. Linguistic variations reinforce apparent political and social divides within Ukraine, with citizens largely debating if the country should join Western partners in Europe or return to being a part of Russia. Even today's current conflict was escalated by President Putin's demand to ban Russia from joining NATO and to reduce NATO equipment and military from Ukraine's eastern border. According to the New York Times, as of today, Russia has stationed around 130,000 troops near Ukraine's border. Most recent escalations have included Russia and China's alliance, the deployment of US troops to Eastern Europe, and the Biden administration's promise of severe sanctions on Russia if there is an invasion. Now, I am pleased to introduce tonight's panelists, who will help us all understand this complex and rapidly developing topic. Russell Bova is the J. William Stewart and Helen D. Stewart Class of 32 Chair in International Studies and Walter E. Beach Class of 56 Chair in Political Science at Dickinson College. His research specializes in Russian politics and Russian political culture. His publications on Russian politics and democracy have appeared in journals such as World Politics, Soviet Studies, and Journal of Democracy. He is also the editor and a contributor to Russian and Western Civilization, Cultural and Historical Encounters. Alina Duz is Associate Professor of Russian at Dickinson College and the previous director of the Dickinson in Moscow program. Her teaching interests include Russian language, literature, and culture, and she teaches classes on Russian theater, art, and contemporary poetry. Her current research centers on contemporary Russian poetry and its relationship to politics. Carl Qualls is the W. Gibbs McKinney Chair in International Education and Professor of History at Dickinson College. His teaching interests concentrate on Russian and German history, interwar Europe, dictators, and refugee history. His most recent publications have examined the impacts of the Soviet Union, particularly his book, From Ruins to Reconstruction, Urban Identity and Soviet Sevastopol After World War II, which discusses the rebuilding and complex of an identity influenced by Ukraine, Russia, and the West. Andrew Wolf is an associate professor of political science and international studies at Dickinson College. His primary interests focus on the geopolitics of NATO enlargement and European security governance. He has also taught classes on US foreign policy, transatlantic relationships, NATO and EU security policy, and international relations theory. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion, expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speakers, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask you to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that handicap accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
All right. I have the unenviable task as a historian to talk about 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years in 10 minutes. So hold on to your seats. First, I want to say, when I mention Russia, I'm talking about the Russian government, not the Russian people, and I think it's really important that we make sure that we understand that those are two very different things. First of all, I want to start with the present and state a position that we hear too much in the media that Putin wants to reconstitute the USSR, and I think that's absolutely nonsense. He seems to prefer instability, which is cheaper for him, so that he can create new dependencies and a new kind of imperial structure with himself as a head. And so I'm going to kind of talk through how that has developed over the last 1,000 years. Excuse me? We can't hear. The microphone is on, and I can hear it up there, so I'm sorry. So I'm going to start with where Zhenya actually started. July 2020, when Putin stated in a speech called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, that he sees these people as one. This is both a historical and a selective misreading that covers up great differences in history, language, and culture. And it's really a mid-19th century idea revived for 21st century nationalism. So let me go back to the origins of these two peoples. They both trace their origins to a period called Kievan Rus over 1,000 years ago. This is a Slavic state that was aided by Viking influence, but was not a unified state by any means. It was really a loose federation of Slavic, Baltic, Finnic, and other Northern European peoples from about the 9th to the 13th century. Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine all see this as the start of their cultures. So there is this shared historical origin. In 988, Orthodox Christianity became the state religion of Kievan Rus after Prince Vladimir was baptized in what is now Sevastopol, Crimea, Ukraine, which is now under occupation by the Russian state. Both Ukraine and Russia see this as the foundation of faith, and was one of the reasons why Russia invaded the peninsula in 2014. It took several centuries in the Mongol invasion in the 13th century for a state centered on Moscow to finally emerge. There are at least 3 different forms of rule that were defined geographically at this period. In the northeast part, where Moscow eventually became a city and a capital, it was the much more autocratic form of state governance. In the Northwest, we had proto-democratic traditions, less autocratic, and more a type of feudal republic. In the Southwest, today's Western Ukraine, we had stronger aristocratic power influenced by trade and cultural contact with Poles, Hungarians, and Lithuanians. This region, Galicia and Volhynia, came under Polish and Lithuanian and Austrian influence for several centuries. After the 14th century, today's Ukraine came under the rule of first the Golden Horde, so this is the remnants of the Mongol Empire, then the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland, and then the Crimean Khanate, another remnant of the Mongol horde. So, why all this detail? Until the 17th century, Russia was not in control of present-day Ukraine, and thus the notions of one people and unity is simply ahistorical and absurd. There are similar roots, but very separate developments. I liken them to being cousins rather than to siblings. The 17th century things get a little stickier. The Treaty of Pereslav in 1654 is where the controversy that we're talking today, I think, really begins. There's a Cossack hetman named Bohdan Khmelnytsky who allied with Russia as the Cossacks tried to counter attacks from Poland. A long war ensued, and at the end of it, Russia ceded territory east of the Dnieper to Russia. Russian scholars see it one way, Ukrainian scholars see it very differently. One says, hey, this is when you gave us your territory. The other said, no, that was actually a temporary agreement. So this is still something that's very hotly debated amongst historians. So at this point, much of Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire. Eastern Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire, precisely at the time that modern nationalism was being born in Europe. So if we shift forward a little bit into the mid-19th century, we see a period of intensive Russification beginning in Ukraine and other places throughout the Russian Empire. It was these imperial authorities, particularly in the 19th century, that began to ban the Ukrainian language, publications, attacked Ukrainian intellectuals, and thwarted further development of political and cultural development in modern-day Ukraine. So, if Russians and Ukrainians indeed were one people and united from the beginning, why were these measures of de-Ukrainianization necessary? If we fast forward to the 20th century and the 1917 Bolshevik coup in November that collapsed the Russian Empire, we see Ukrainian activists declaring their independence in the beginning of January 1918, as did Ukrainians who were also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was collapsing at the same time. This gave birth to the Ukrainian People's Republic, very short-lived from 1917 to 1920. And as the Soviet revolutionary government occupied most of Ukraine in 1920, the Bolsheviks recognized Ukraine as a separate nation constituted in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. 1922 and 23, the Soviet Union created a federal structure of government to respond to the demands of the more independently minded Bolsheviks in both Ukraine and Georgia, whose communist leaders didn't want to be incorporated into a Russian federation. And you should note that both these countries were invaded in 2008, Georgia, and then 2014, Ukraine. So Ukraine became part of what eventually became part of the Soviet Union, one of 15 republics, although the very western part of Ukraine only came in 1939 after the Soviet pact with Nazi Germany. So a significant portion of western Ukraine had been part of Russia for about 50 of its 1,000 years. So again, this notion of one people of all time seems very ahistorical to me. Then throughout the 1930s, the Great Famine, and during World War II, Ukrainian intellectuals and nationalists were again persecuted by the Soviet central government. During that same decade, a crash industrialization program led by Stalin and for many decades beyond, Russian citizens were sent into eastern Ukraine for its mining and metallurgy industries. This is the breakaway region we see today. In this area called Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk. And so there are many Russian speakers in that region. That doesn't necessarily mean they're all pro-Russian. For most of the Soviet period, Russian was taught as a second language in Ukraine, some places as a primary language, and it was certainly the language of social development and social advancement, which is why many Ukrainians speak Russian, including the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. So again, if these were indeed one people and united, why was Ukraine treated in this matter, again, in the 20th century? Fast forwarding, and I'll conclude here with the 1990s as the Soviet Union begins to collapse. 1991, Ukrainians voted for independence, and with Belarus and Russia, they dissolved the USSR and formed the Commonwealth of Independent States. Russian President Boris Yeltsin wanted to maintain a union, but could not do it without Ukraine's economy, particularly its agriculture and its metallurgy. From 1991, Russia supported independence, but only on condition that the former republics remained allied with Russia in its sphere of influence, much as which Putin is trying to do today. 3 years later, in 1994, Ukraine lost its leverage. With Russia, the UK, and the US, it gave up its nuclear weapons. It was the third largest nuclear state in the world at that point. And they were assured that their country would be respected and not threatened, and its borders would be sovereign if it handed over its nuclear weapons. So in 2014, Russia violated that agreement, invading both Crimea and the eastern parts of Ukraine. And the US and UK did very little and stood by, so they didn't live up to their bargain as well. This has led to very dangerous discussions in Ukraine today about rearming with nuclear weapons. Highly dangerous, but also highly improbable given the cost and the complications that it would create. So in 2014, we see Ukraine moving further towards the west, which will be talked about in just a second. President Putin tried to stop this with a $15 billion loan to the Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who is a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine. And this led to the 2014 Orange Revolution and the destabilization that we see in Ukraine today that's cost 14,000 lives and about 1.5 million internally displaced people. So the result of this war is really important. If we look at the year before the war, only 20% of Ukrainians wanted to be part of NATO. Today, that is 60%. And so Russia has misplayed its hand, I think, quite terribly. So in conclusion, Putin's notion of one people and one union makes sense only if one accepts that they're both developed out of a culture based in Kiev and not vice versa. Moscow was founded centuries after Kiev and much of Ukraine was out of Moscow's sphere for even longer. Throughout much of the last century and a half, in particular, Moscow authorities have implemented policies restricting Ukrainian language and publication and sought to suppress Ukrainian national sentiment. Yes, there are many shared traditions and cultures, language similarities, religious similarities, but they aren't the same, just as Canada and the United States are not the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I've got 10 to 12 minutes to try and give you a sense of what Russia is up to in Ukraine. If you ask a professor his name, it usually takes 10 to 12 minutes to give an answer. So I'm going to do my best and give you a very arguably superficial understanding of what the issues are, but with plenty of opportunity in the Q&A to ask for more detail on any of the things that I address. I'm going to organize my comments in terms of 3 questions that I'm going to try to help you think about. First, what does Russia want with respect to Ukraine? Secondly, what is the likelihood that a military invasion of Ukraine by Russia will take place? And third, perhaps the most interesting question from my point of view is, how did we get to this point? You know, 25 years ago, relations between Russia and the West, Russia and the United States, were very friendly. Today, we have a crisis. So how did we get to this point? And related to that, to what extent does Russia have legitimate grievances here in its relationship with the West? So I'm going to say a few things about each of those questions. First of all, what does Russia want? Well, the Russians told us what they wanted just a few weeks ago when they submitted a draft agreement to the Biden administration that they asked the Biden administration to consider and, in fact, to sign. And indeed, they insisted that they wanted a formal agreement for reasons I'll get to later. There were a number of demands made in this draft agreement presented by the Russians, but let me just summarize it by reference to 2 basic points. First of all, there was reference in that draft agreement, as one might expect, to Ukraine in particular. What they said in the draft agreement is that they wanted a commitment from the United States that there would be no expansion of NATO to Ukraine itself. And secondarily, and also related to Ukraine, that there would be no deployments of military forces or personnel from NATO to Ukraine going forward. So a focal point of that draft agreement was Ukraine itself. But the draft agreement also illustrated that Russia was interested in something broader than that, and that is a reimagining of the post-Cold War security architecture for Central and Eastern Europe. And reflecting that, the draft agreement also said that they wanted a commitment from the Biden administration not to expand NATO anywhere going forward, not just to Ukraine. And perhaps most significantly, and perhaps hardest for the Biden administration to accept, a rolling back of NATO military deployments in Central and Eastern Europe to where they were in 1997, before the first expansion of NATO to Poland, to the Czech Republic, and to Hungary had taken place. So that would mean, in effect, removal of NATO military forces from places like Poland, from Estonia, from Lithuania, where relatively modest but NATO forces are now in place. The Biden administration was quite clear that these demands were largely non-starters and that they could not be accepted and embraced. So that leads to the second question. Given those demands, given the Biden administration and the NATO response, what are the odds that Russia will then take the next step of a military incursion into Ukraine? Now, let me answer that question by challenging two what I consider to be unpersuasive ways of thinking about this that you hear from pundits in the media. One unpersuasive way of looking at this is to say that Putin, from the very beginning, wanted diplomacy to fail, that he was demanding things in that draft agreement that he knew Biden could not or would not be able to accept, and assuming Biden would say no, that this would provide a pretext for an invasion. I am not at all persuaded by that argument. The cost of an invasion of Ukraine by Russia would not be insignificant, and the risk would be relatively high for Putin and for Russia. Putin, I think, would prefer to get what he wants, or get some proportion of what he wants, by simple, what we call coercive diplomacy. Coercive diplomacy is a demonstration of military power. It could be testing of a new weapon system, it could be war games, or in this case, as you can see on the map up here, it could be deployment of roughly 120, 130,000 troops around the country of Ukraine. I think Putin's preference is that coercive diplomacy will be enough to pressure Ukraine and pressure Biden and pressure NATO in general to accede to at least some of the demands in that draft agreement without having to fire a shot. So I don't think the demands were simply a pretext for an invasion. On the other hand, I think the opposite argument that you also hear in the media is also unpersuasive. And that argument is that Putin is bluffing. That if we stand tough and resist his demands, that he will back down. I also am unpersuaded by that argument. Maybe, a couple of months ago, I might have been more open to that suggestion. But I think we've passed the point of no return, or Putin has passed the point of no return. He's got, again, 125,000 troops deployed around Ukraine. I think he needs more than a symbolic off-ramp. He needs something substantial. Now, not necessarily everything that he's asking it for in that draft agreement, but enough for him to be able to say to both his domestic audience, and there I'm talking about not just the Russian public, but also the rest of the Russian political elite, and perhaps just as importantly, his international audience, the United States, NATO, the world in general, that he is serious about what he is asking for us. So my view of the situation is as follows, right? War is not inevitable, that a diplomatic solution might be possible, I think less likely as every day goes on, but it is not something that was off the table from the beginning, but that the threat to invade, I think, is real, right? Unless Putin gets something substantial, again, to meet at least some of the demands that they have made, I don't think he is bluffing. And there are a variety of different scenarios for what that invasion might look like. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them now for reasons of time, but it could be a modest Russian support to the separatists in the Donbass region that Professor Klaus mentioned. It could be building a land or creating a land corridor between Russia and Crimea along the Sea of Azov. It could be an occupation of all of eastern Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, or it could be, and this is the worst case scenario, all of those combined with an attempt to occupy Kyiv as well. I have my own thoughts about which of those scenarios is more likely, but if you're interested, we can get into that in the Q&A. Finally, the last point. How did we get to this stage? How did the good relations between Russia and the West in the 90s deteriorate to the point of crisis that we have now? And does Russia have legitimate grievances? Before I give you my answer to that second question in particular, I want to preface it with the following. Ukraine is a sovereign state, duly recognized as such under international law. As such, its territorial integrity and political sovereignty must be respected. In fact, in 1997, Russia and Ukraine signed a treaty of friendship in which they each agreed to respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of one another. So, any Russian incursion into Ukraine, whether it's one soldier or 100,000 soldiers, would be an act of aggression under international law and a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Moreover, I would add that Russia bears itself some of the responsibility for the deterioration of relations that we see today. And that includes the 2014 invasion of Crimea, but it also includes other things that occurred prior to that. So what I'm saying at the beginning here is I'm not letting Russia off the hook. That said, I do think Russia has legitimate security concerns in Central and Eastern Europe related to the expansion of NATO that has taken place from the 1990s up to the present. Let me go to the next slide here. NATO, at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, had 16 members. These are the countries in the dark blue. Since the late 1990s, NATO has added 14 additional members for a total of 30, which include countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and several others that were former members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led military alliance. It also includes 3 countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that were once a part of the Soviet Union itself. To put it somewhat differently, St. Petersburg, Putin's hometown, by the way, which used to be located about 1,200 miles from the nearest NATO border, is now located 100 miles. I would submit that any government in Moscow, Democrat, authoritarian, that any Russian leader, Putin, Yeltsin before him, Gorbachev, would be troubled by the expansion of NATO that close to Russian borders. Related to that, and this will be my last point, the Russians also are aggrieved not just because of the expansion of NATO, but because they believe that they were given assurances in the 1990s that such expansion would not take place. Now, let me state from the beginning, this is a subject of much debate, even among Western scholars. What was said to the Russians, what was promised, what was not promised. Again, I'm running out of time, so I can cite you chapter and verse in the Q&A if you want to get a better sense of why Russians might believe that they had assurances. But I think that is the perspective from Moscow. Finally, in conclusion, one of the consequences of the of the expansion of NATO is that Ukraine has been left on the outside looking in, right? A new line has been drawn in Europe, just a bit further to the east than it was before, right? But Ukraine remains on the wrong side of the line, so to speak. And so from Ukraine's point of view, the way that NATO expansion has proceeded has left them with the worst of both worlds. Expansion of NATO to many other countries in the former Eastern Bloc, but Ukraine left on the wrong side of that line. Okay, so let me stop at that point, and I'll be happy to take questions and push back on some of this in the Q&A. Is it?
Next.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carl and Russ. Thank you all for coming. I definitely enjoyed Russ's analysis, and I think I'm going to push back on some of the things he said, which is hopefully we'll get some debate here going. My task tonight is to review America and Europe's role and position in this current crisis. And this is a big task, and like everyone else has said, I fear I won't have time to go over all the dynamics at play. So definitely in Q&A, we can go into more depth about what the Americans are thinking and what different Europeans, the EU, are thinking, and NATO. How has the West responded to this crisis is really my primary question, right? I want to just illuminate what are the different actions and maybe possible failure to act that both NATO, the United States, Europe, as in the European Union, I'm calling this all the West, has taken in this current crisis. If you look back, Russia has amassed troops on Ukraine's borders in the past, since 2014, right? And even in the spring of 2021, in April, they amassed over 130, 140,000 troops, very similar to today. That was very disconcerting to Western analysts. Western capitals were very concerned about this, but it didn't create a crisis like today, right? So how come in December of last year, just a couple of months ago, this amassing of troops creates a very big crisis? What's the difference? What changed? And I think what has changed is exactly what Russ mentioned. It's Russia's list of demands issued on December 17th. And that list of demands was made public by the Russian Foreign Ministry. You can read it. There's no mystery to it about what they wanted. This changed the political calculus. This really activated the crisis. And how did that do? Why did it happen? Well, I think Russia's demands were so grand in scope, so broad in scale, very bellicose, I would say, and not rooted in reality. Right? It signaled to Western capitals that Russia is very serious about what's going on. They are willing to go to conflict. They're risking going to conflict. And in fact, when they issued the list of demands, they asked for a written answer within a week, right? And you don't normally do that in diplomacy, in normal diplomacy. That's a level of hostility that goes outside the normal parameters. It took a month for the West, for the U.S. and NATO to respond, but they did respond in writing. What was that response? Well, I think the response was rather firm. You can read the leaked document. It was leaked last week on the Spanish newspaper El País. And I did read it a number of times. And it shows the U.S. and NATO and Western partners having fortitude in this crisis. It was a very principled response, very firm. There was no hints of appeasement, right? There were mentions of sort of avenues of discussion, of negotiation, particularly on missile deployments, arms reduction, maybe new rules for monitoring exercises, military exercises in Russia and in Europe. But in other examples, the West pushed back, right? Russia's demand for all NATO military units to be withdrawn from Eastern Europe, the response to that was, well, Russia, you need to withdraw all your troops illegally stationed in Moldova, in Georgia, and also in Ukraine, in Donbass and Crimea. And of course, Russia's not going to do that. So I think we're on a collision course here from these documents. There's very little wiggle room, so to speak. What else has NATO been doing? Well, I think they have been very effective at bolstering the West, creating some level of cohesion. There's been constant dialogue within the alliance and amongst European capitals. I mean, just a fury of activity. And I would say that that basically NATO members have decided to send reinforcements to their eastern allies in the Baltics and also in Romania and Bulgaria. For example, Denmark is sending 700 troops to Lithuania as well as F-16 fighter jets. Spain and the Netherlands are sending squadrons, jet fighters, to Bulgaria to set up an air monitoring, air surveillance exercise. Bulgaria currently doesn't have any F-16 fighter jets. The U.S. is sending 3,000 more troops to Poland and also Romania. This is about a 50 or 60% increase in U.S. troops in Eastern Europe. Still very small, I'm going to change that. It's still pretty small. I would say it's about 8,500 in total. It's an increase, but it's not a huge amount of troops we're talking about here, particularly in comparison to what Russia has in Belarus and along the Ukrainian border, more than 100,000 troops, right? Since 2016, NATO has instituted a program of having battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland. This is called Enhanced Forward Presence. It's basically 5,000 troops in total, led by various nations, including the United States, Germany, Canada, and Britain. It's a multinational forces, and they're spread out amongst these 4 countries. In total, the amount of new troop commitments to enhance forward presence is about 2,000 additional troops. So we're really not talking about a huge escalation in terms of military numbers in comparison to what Russia has been doing. And if you look at sort of complaints about, U.S. military presence in general in Europe, the U.S. has about 80,000 troops stationed in Europe today. Most of those are in 3 countries, in Germany, Italy, and Spain, right? And less than 10,000 are in Eastern Europe, okay? And if you go back 30 years, right, there were 180,000 troops in Europe. And if you go back even further during the Cold War, it got up to 300,000. So the amount of American troops stationed in Europe is significantly lower than in the past. And all the news about the U.S. sending troops to Europe, it's really very small, tiny sliver. It's more about symbolism, signaling, maybe adding some capabilities, but it's not a huge deterrent in terms of military affairs. What else has the West been doing? Well, they have been pursuing multiple avenues of diplomacy in multiple international fora. You have bilateral negotiations between the U.S. and Russia, between France and Russia. You have talks at the OSCE. You have talks at the NATO-Russia Council that's been resurrected to talk about this. You've had talks at the UN Security Council. You know, if Russia and Putin wanted more attention, they're definitely getting it now, right? They're getting a huge amount of diplomatic attention. And to coordinate all this is quite complex amongst Western allies, but I think they're doing a fairly good job. And if you look at sort of the wider sort of sentiment in Europe, I think what Russian behavior is doing is sort of galvanizing a little bit more cohesion amongst the West. You have Sweden and Norway, Sweden and Finland thinking of moving closer to NATO. You also have Ireland actually even starting to think about joining NATO. I mean, this is just the initial conversation. And you even have 2 weeks ago, Irish fishermen going out and deterring the Russian Navy off the coast of Ireland, right? This is really unheard of. It's unthinkable that this is going on. And so I think Russia, through its behavior, is shooting itself in its own foot, and it's actually consolidating the West to a limited degree. That being said, I did say limited. I think there are some huge fissures and cracks within Western cohesion. I don't think there's unity, and I think that unity is rather superficial, right? Look at France and what France is doing. President Macron has complained about the fact that the European Union has not been involved in this crisis very much. He wants the EU to be sort of a leader in negotiations, and he's called for the European Union to have separate negotiations with Russia on this issue, right? Basically cutting out the Americans and NATO. And he even met with Putin just this Monday to kind of sort of personalize his leadership of what's going on. Here's a picture of that negotiations that happened Monday. I know this looks funny. This is like something out of a Bond movie or some like Looney Tunes cartoon. This is not normal diplomacy, right? This is a op-ed, this is a photo op, and usually they're sitting next to each other and intimate and showing their close relations. This is about intimidation and showing sort of distance. At the press conference after this meeting, Vladimir Putin, I think he was off his Ritalin or something, to be blunt. I mean, he was so bombastic. He said that if Ukraine joins NATO, that Europe will automatically be at war with Russia. He said that if Europe doesn't solve this crisis, and give in to Russian demands, Europe will be dragged into a war whether it wants to or not. Okay? This is not the dialogue of peace and diplomacy. This is very bombastic. Excuse me. Let's go on to another issue. Germany, another state. Germany also is showing signs of sort of cracks in the Western cohesion. What's going on with Germany? Well, I mean, they definitely say that they support NATO. They say they're in lockstep with NATO. They're sending more troops to Lithuania, about 350 more troops. However, if you look at what happened Monday when German Chancellor Olaf Scholz met with Joe Biden in the White House, you see some worrying signs. The German Chancellor refused to admit that Nord Stream 2 pipeline would be a part of any potential sanctions on Russia if Russia were to invade Ukraine. Germany has furthermore refused to provide military equipment and arms to Ukraine. And moreover, it has even stopped the transfer of German-made weapons from third countries to Ukraine, specifically Estonia. So German-made weapons that Estonia uses, Germany has not issued permits for those to be transferred to Ukraine. What's going on with Germany? Well, the SDP, Schulz's party, is traditionally rather soft and comfortable with Russia. The former chancellor of SDP chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, is the current chairman of the board of Rosneft, one of Russia's main energy companies. Furthermore, Germany is quite constrained legally in arms exports. Whatever the reason why Germany is behaving the way it is, Eastern allies in Ukraine are very upset, and they see they see Germany as not being very supportive in this crisis. I do want to mention one other point. Even the U.S. is causing rifts in the alliance. In January, Joe Biden gave a press conference, and he mentioned that the form of a potential incursion will dictate NATO's response. That's basically what he said. This was highly problematic for Eastern allies and for Ukraine because it implies that a small invasion, say just in Donbass, means it won't trigger a tough NATO response, right? That may be true, right? And I think what Biden said is exactly true. But it sows dissension amongst Western allies, right, when there needs to be more unity. And I also want to mention, just as a side point, under no circumstances is NATO demanded to go to war if Russia invades Ukraine. There's no Article 5 protections over Ukraine. So NATO has taken that off the board. Right? There will be no military response if Russia invades. So in sum, I think the West did not start this latest crisis. It did not. The West has been fairly active and efficient in creating cohesion where possible. However, there are major differences that remain over how to engage Russia. There are differences over how to support Ukraine, provide arms or not. There are major differences over how to respond to Russia if it evades, what type of sanctions. And furthermore, there really are very few viable diplomatic solutions to this crisis at present. Very few. I think Putin will successively exploit Western disunity and gain some of his objectives. And I think Russia is in the driver's seat, not the West. The West is being reactive, not proactive in this crisis. Thank you.
My task was to talk a little bit about Russia's reaction to this crisis. And because I'm not a political science or historian and Ukraine is not my area of specialization, I talk about this more like a regular citizen. However, I did spend many years carefully reading and listening to what's happening in Ukraine, sometimes obsessively. In the last year, I would every day listen to mostly Ukrainian political scientists, philosophers. There are some platforms that I trust, and they bring people with different opinions, different voices. Even this morning, I listen to this. And of course, I listen to Russian experts. I don't watch Russian TV. I did watch it twice on YouTube to prepare for this event. But one cannot, if it's a state TV, you cannot take it for more than 10 minutes. But I do listen and read experts from Carnegie Moscow, from other places. They're serious political scientists. Their analysis, very interesting, very convincing. I just want to make that statement before I move on to what have I prepared. There's not once that I heard or read from a serious political scientist or from Ukrainian political scientists or philosopher or economist or people whom I listen to who truly believe that war is possible. This morning, when I listened to that particular platform, it's called Ukr Live TV, and the person who always holds conversations with these people, she said the following. She said to one of the guests, this morning when I opened newspapers, American newspapers, again and again and again, this was mention of inevitable war. What is happening? Can you explain what's happening in the United States? Again and again and again, I hear that we don't believe in war. Russia, Putin says, you know, we don't plan war. No, serious, I'm not talking about state television. I'm talking about serious people. Carnegie Moscow people, they say there's absolutely no indication that there's going to be a war. This is a kind of a trick, a strategy, a pressure that Putin wants to put on Western powers to solicit response. And response has to do with recognition of Russia's right to have security concerns. And the exchange that took place, Russian commentators took it very, very positively. They said, hooray, for the first time, US actually recognizes that Russia might have security concerns, because before, and of course with those comments you get a lot of jokes, before, and actually response from NATO was again in that particular tone as opposed to the response from United States government. And the response from UN was, from United States, that we do recognize you have a certain concern, and while we are not going to stop the expansion to the east, now we offer to sit down and have serious conversations about missiles of short and medium range, and about certain limitations of military exercises next to the border, because US, I guess, voluntarily stepped out of the agreements that had before. And in the last several years, I noticed in the news that there were often incidents when a Russian plane would be following an American plane. Why? Because by Russian standards, it got too close to the border. So now, that's what I hear from the commentators. US is offering to sit down and talk about those pretty important things. Now, they also say that US response is very cleverly crafted, that while it sounds that it's very harsh and states that that it will not stop expanding to the east, and they have to have, or they will continue to have, the policy of open doors. There are little indication that they are willing to negotiate. They're willing to negotiate, not that very thing that they open doors, but other little things. So overall, the Russian commentators take it very, very positively, while they say that the response from NATO has a typical kind of language that they compare with Soviet language. So, and I guess what I wanted to say before is that normally it was understood, and nobody was to argue with it, that NATO brings security and happiness and prosperity, and of course, who can even question the expansion of NATO? So that, I guess, I wanted to say, because I was quite surprised, because I was so much into reading Russian and Ukrainian responses to that crisis, and I also knew that American press has this hysteria. That's what Russians and Ukrainians call. So the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, had to make several statements, partly because their stock market was collapsing because of that hysteria in the West, mostly not in the West, but specifically in the United States. They cannot get it, and the president had to make several statements saying that no, we don't, there's nothing changed. There's the troops were there before, so there's one interpretation. Actually, not one interpretation. Everybody's saying that one of the reasons that U.S. escalates it because they connected with Biden's weakness inside, and that so this is a good way to kind of imitate a possibility of war. While, of course, Putin is using it to trigger or to force the West to negotiate with him. But the United States, they say, needs it to kind of create the impression of possibility of war, maybe even third war, and then at a certain point, they say, and it's not voice of one. I mean, it's just kind of very commonly accepted by now interpretation that at a certain point, so the possible war would be kind of won, and so Biden shows his muscle. So this is, I guess, it's just my spontaneous response to what I hear. But I don't know how much time I have. I think it was unplanned. A couple of minutes. If I have a couple of minutes, that I just briefly give a summary of, that's what my students wanted today in my Russia in the West. In this couple of minutes, I just give how an average Russian, how Putin, how an average Russian, and so of course the state TV, is strongly propagandistic tool, but there are certain pieces of information that is incorporated in the narrative of serious analysts like those who work for Carnegie Moscow. So, but maybe I'm just a little bit torn whether I had to present the narrative to my students, and it seems that they were not even clear about what is this conflict. Or rather, I should say, spend my 2 minutes to show how much it bothers the Russians, that two very close nations, not the same but close, are not together anymore. So this winter I was in Russia, and one of my relatives, when the subject of Ukraine came up, he said, "This is tragic," and this is just very common to hear that, "This is tragic that we quarreled with the help of the United States." And so I had to say, do you watch a lot of state television? And so he left, and I started to think about it. And of course, the propaganda will tell you a lot about U.S. role, but in reality, it's quite considerable, sending. It all had to do with U.S. support of the 2014, what Russia believes unconstitutional change of power, which was a result of the Maidan revolution when President Yanukovych was ousted months before his term almost ended. He was highly corrupted, as all, except for this one, presidents after him. And there was an agreement reached that certain number of months are given so Ukrainians get their act together and can elect a new president. But I guess the riots continued, and he was ousted, and he was a kind of East Russia-oriented president. And with that, you know, the new president was elected who was strongly supporting Western policies. So I lost my thought. The tragedy of it. So the tragedy of it, I'm responding maybe to Carl's presentation that we're not one people. But I also understood, talking to my relative, why is it that for so many years I so obsessively listened to the voices of Ukrainians, because it actually pains. It's very difficult, and we know it's very difficult for Americans to understand that two people with common history, the history is common, especially the Soviet years, can feel pain about the fact that we're not together. And hooray to the opinion polls, so where emotions and pain can be actually translated into numbers. Just recently, I think in November of 2021, an opinion poll about satisfaction or not satisfaction of Russians in the state's international policies was taken. And the first issue that pains Russian, and then they say this is the failure of Russian government, is that it didn't find a way to keep those nations, not together necessarily, but not to quarrel. And I think it's maybe a good point to stop here.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to get to you before asking your question. We reserve the first questions for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
This one's for Professor Bova and Professor Wolf. You both mentioned that it's still maybe a possibility that a diplomatic resolution occurs. What do you see that diplomatic resolution looking like?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic about the possibility along those lines. But, you know, I think we have to be diplomatically creative, okay? And let's take the central issue of Ukraine and its possible membership in NATO. Let's be realistic. Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO anytime soon, right? Irrespective of the current crisis. So find some diplomatic language, right, to convey that message to the Russians. You know, a moratorium, right, on NATO expansion going forward, either in general or with respect to Ukraine in particular. Now, I understand, you know, the concern is you don't like to make concessions with a gun pointed to your head, but you find some creative language in order to deal with that. Let me just give you a kind of a parallel. And the solution is not the same necessarily, but to show you how difficult diplomatic problems can somehow be resolved. Take the issue of Taiwan. For 50 years, right, we've managed to handle that issue through a policy of strategic ambiguity, right? Is Taiwan an independent state or not? Well, formally not, but it behaves pretty much like it, right, in many respects. Will the United States come to the defense of Taiwan if it's attacked? Well, you know, maybe we will, maybe we won't, right? Strategic ambiguity. I'm not saying that's exactly the same approach to Ukraine, But here's a good example, right, of a thorny issue, right, in relations between two countries, and for 50 years it worked. Now the Taiwan issue, maybe that strategic ambiguity, it's running its course, but if we can find a solution to the Ukraine problem for the next 50 years, I think that would be considered a success.
I would add, I think I agree with Russ is saying, and some sort of finessing of language to communicate that Ukraine probably won't get into NATO. That makes sense. And they're not going to get into NATO because NATO members have already said it's not going to happen. They said it in 2008. There's no appetite for it. So, which is also a curious thing about this conflict is because Russia believes that, or says they believe that Ukraine's going to get into NATO, but there's really no push for that. There's no actual movement in that regard. Any potential negotiation, I think it would cover missiles, right? Sort of withdrawing of missiles from Kaliningrad, but also from Germany or maybe some other places. Reinstituting the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty in some form or fashion, updated for the 21st century, where there's less Western military personnel in Eastern Europe, but also less Russian units in Western Russia. I think that could be reached. And that's about it. And maybe a couple of agreements on how to monitor exercises and more transparency. But I don't see where there's many room for movement on a lot of these issues. I believe Putin has kind of painted himself in a corner diplomatically. He's come out with such a broad range of demands. He's got to reach a lot of them, and he's got to say, "I've succeeded," right? And I don't think he's on a path towards succeeding in getting those negotiations, in a negotiated fashion. So I think we're stuck at the moment unless something creative comes up.
Can I just add something? That I believe it's a Bucharest conference meeting, a NATO meeting, where it was stated that the intention to take Ukraine and Georgia as a member of NATO. After that, when Poroshenko was president of Ukraine, he made sure that it is stated in Ukrainian constitution that their path is to join NATO and European Union. So it is stated in legal documents. So just recently in one of those conversations, maybe with Macron, Putin mentioned that, just think about it, if it is stated in Ukraine's legal documents that they will be trying to get Crimea back, including with military forces, imagine if Ukraine becomes like Romania, full of NATO weapons. So yeah, it is not NATO, but the weapons and instructors are there, so it's worse than NATO. So formally you're not, but all instructors and weapons are there. And when Ukraine feels that it's full of weapons and it tries to take Ukraine with force, he says, and this is convincing, you want us to fight with NATO. So there is a way to have a conflict even if Ukraine is not legally a part of NATO.
I was just going to respond that in terms of the 2008 Bucharest summit, where this decision was made, it's actually, I think, a little bit more nuanced than that. France and Germany and a number of countries internal to the NATO summit said that there's no way Ukraine can get into NATO in 2008 because we're worried about the Russian response. And Putin was there at the meeting. He could address the North Atlantic Council. And he gave a press conference stating his view. This is back when we were in much better relations with Russia, or better relationship with Russia. And the reason why what happened is that NATO denied Ukraine and Georgia an official path towards membership called a Membership Action Plan, but then promised them that you're going to get into NATO one day. I think that's an original sin of this crisis that the West made, because they didn't want to let down Georgia and Ukraine. They felt that if they said no, full stop, that would derail their reform process and movements in those countries. And yes, Russia can rightly point to it. He said, hey, you promised that NATO would, that Ukraine would get into NATO. But technically they didn't, and there's no agreement to get in, and legally they can't get in. There's so many barriers to Ukraine getting in They don't meet NATO enlargement criteria in any sense of the word. So, and I don't think they're ever going to get in the next 30 years. So it's just not a possibility when it's brought up.
I would agree with that, and it's also just too dangerous to allow Ukraine in, because then NATO would have to defend it if Russia did something. Right. I want to push back a little bit on some of these things. I agree with Russ that Russia has some real strategic concerns here, and in some ways I think they've already won part of this problem, because this is a victory for Putin. He got another world leader to finally talk to him. And this has nothing to do with power politics. Macron refused to take a COVID test. That's why the table is so long. I'm serious. Yeah. And Putin has very carefully created a bubble around him so he doesn't get COVID. That's what this is about. It's not about power politics. Putin has been very consistent for the last 20 years. What he wants is Russia's position at the international table again. For 75 years, the Soviet Union was in on every major discussion in the globe. Particularly when the color revolution started happening and the US is in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, Russia is extremely concerned because they're no longer at the table in these discussions. When 1991 happens and the US in particular throws up its hands and says, we win, with no creative thinking about what Europe should look like after the Cold War, right? Let's remember why NATO was created. NATO was created as a defense mechanism against the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union no longer exists, why does NATO exist, right? The EU should have its own military power, but why should NATO exist, right? This is how Russia and Putin, I want to say Russians, but Russia and Putin see this conflict, is American hubris, well, not just American, I mean, look at the UK. I think Elena's completely right. If you look at the, Putin putting troops out there causing concern, it has gotten only worse by statements from Boris Johnson and President Biden saying it's imminent and then it's only 70% ready, but then it can happen any day again. Zelensky is saying, it's not going to happen, people. Calm down. It's hysteria. Is being driven by the Western allies, particularly the United States and the UK, making this far worse than it needed to be. Putin is trying to get Western attention because all of Western attention, particularly the US, has gone to China.
And he's getting it.
And he's getting it, exactly. I think this is a big victory for him, right? And Germany is starting to get into the ring as well. Does it solve the problems? Absolutely not, right? I think a lot of the things that Andy's talking about, missiles, I think also talking about the Minsk agreement again, which has never been implemented since 2015. What do we do in those breakaway republics in the East? I think something has to be done there. Putin's going to be looking for something to do there. But I think the probability of invasion, certainly a large invasion, it's not zero, but it's pretty darn close.
Just one short comment is when U.S. it seems tries to put pressure on Germany, there is perhaps a lack of understanding that Germany is a country that devastated Ukraine and Russia. When it all started, there was an anniversary of the end of Leningrad siege, and there was, at least on Russian television, Putin, by himself because of COVID restrictions. There was a long ceremony, and it was broadcasted everywhere, including in Europe. So Putin did remind Europe, did remind Germany of what was done to Ukraine and Russia, to those two brotherly, sisterly nations. And Germany is doing very well. Germany sent 500 helmets. That was it. Of course, a lot of jokes in Russia, but that's what they did. They sent 500 or 5,000 maybe helmets, and they refuse. They don't want to arm one republic against the other, or one former republic, one country that they devastated not that long time ago. And U.S. should not put pressure on Germany. Germany knows what it is doing.
This question is for the whole panel. So the former president of the United States, you may have heard of him, his name is Donald. So during his 4 years in power, he threatened to disband NATO. He was impeached for essentially blackmailing Ukraine. That's kind of simple. And then he also called the entire American political system into jeopardy by questioning the 2020 election. To what degree have these actions contributed to this moment?
Thanks for the question, Sam. I think it's made things incredibly worse. I mean, Andy can say a lot more about this, but once you start questioning the very existence of NATO, at this point, I think 1991, we could have talked about it again, but when you start questioning the very existence of NATO, that's brilliant for Putin. Because now he says, well, wait a minute, this is no longer an alliance, a firm alliance. And he can see cracks, and he can penetrate those cracks and break it apart. We see that, with Viktor Orban in Hungary in particular. This is one of the dumbest things that we could possibly have done to our allies. And I think it opened a great opportunity for Putin to exploit, and I think he is.
I would add, it's actually, so long as Trump was in office, Putin in Russia loved it because he sowed so much discord within NATO.
Not so. He actually, one of the reasons that urgency to sign all those papers now is because, at least that's what the Russian commentators say, that Putin and Biden have very good chemistry. That Biden, because he was a part of Obama's administration for so long, and then he understands Russia better. So they really know, they don't know how long he will last here, but they want to have that negotiation while a predictable, more or less predictable Biden is in power, not Putin, who's totally unpredictable.
But when Biden got in office, that changed, that discord changed, and he signaled very strongly that he was going to reinvigorate NATO. He started a security dialogue with the European Union. The European Union is going through something called its strategic compass, where it's trying to figure out how it can build a more robust military presence and also forge sort of a common perception about security. And at the same time, NATO is undergoing something called a strategic concept, where it's mapping out for the next 10 years its mandate going forward in the future. And this is all happening under Biden. And so from a Russian perspective, you now see the West organizing itself and trying to rebuild and coordinate more intensely. So you've got to do something now, because if you wait, the West and Europe, NATO is going to be much more intensely tied together.
If I can just piggyback on that a little bit and answer the question more broadly. If you're looking at the situation from Putin's point of view, this is the time. If you're going to act, this is the time to act for a variety of different reasons. You look at the United States, you've got political discord and polarization. You've got preoccupation with COVID. You've got a kind of a desire on the part of the United States to focus their attention on East Asia and China. You've got a kind of general retrenchment from various parts of the world, including the Middle East. Think of Afghanistan, for example. And on the other side of the ledger, you look at Ukraine and you kind of sense a westward drift, right? And so you ask yourself, if not now, if you're Putin, if not now, what will the situation be like in five years? Right? Will the United States be in a better position? Will they have their act together? Will Ukraine have drifted so far that it's too late to kind of do anything about it? I think Putin's looking at the situation. He's saying the risk of doing something now is high. The cost might be high, but the cost of doing something in 5 years will even be higher, and the cost of doing nothing at all, right, has costs attached to it as well. So just to have a little fun on the panel, I'm going to disagree just a little bit with Professor Quarles here. I don't think war is inevitable, but I would put the risk a little bit higher. I would say 50-50. And by war, I don't mean, right, occupation of Ukraine entirely. It could be something as small as Russian forces into the Donbass region to solidify the Russian separatists there, or something along those lines. So I think the risk to war is, I'm more worried, right, than perhaps some of my colleagues on the panel are.
I wouldn't consider that war because it's pretty much already going on through their mercenaries and the militias in Donetsk. I mean, certainly they could do more, right? But yeah, I'm thinking more of the invasion of massive amounts.
Yeah, okay, well, but that sounds a little bit like Biden, right? You know, it depends on how big the incursion is, right? As I said before.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have said what Biden did either. That was just very bad leadership.
Yeah.
This is a broad question to the panel. I'm just curious, how far do you think this could escalate as part on like Western provocation, mostly from, as you said, the UK and the US, and just general anti-Russian attitudes among these groups that seem kind of out of proportion for what's occurring, at least to some extent? Like how much of this crisis might be driven by just these few actors rather than the whole West as a whole?
I'm sorry, just can you clarify, by what actors are you talking about?
I'm mostly speaking about the United Kingdom and the United States generally, because the European Union seems a bit more level-headed about this. I don't want to make broad statements about foreign policy for them, but it seems, at least by that perception, to be true.
I would say, sure, there's some shrillness in the media and among certain officials in Britain and America about this. Maybe a little, and they've pulled back a little bit on some of the language. Because some of the initial language in January that was used was also pretty aggressive in saying that an invasion is imminent. The U.S. evacuated personnel from the embassy in Kyiv. So, that might have been a premature step. Usually that's a pretty bad signal when that happens. How much is it responsible just of that sort of attitudes over reaction? It's hard to say it's all overreaction because on the other side, Russia has issued, like I said, a number of demands that are just over the top, right? It's more than just get attention. It is it's breathtaking. It's like what Austria issued, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire issued to Serbia in the summer of 1914, right? It's completely unreasonable. And so I think there is overreaction on both sides. There's a lot of miscommunication going on. And I will say, in sort of a political perspective, anti-Russianness has been the name of the game for the past 4 years under Trump. And so it's sort of baked into the cake already for both political parties in America. So when a crisis is triggered, you see that muscle reflex react. Is that muscle reflex justified? I think it's mostly justified in this situation.
Can you just make a little addition to the unreasonable demands? Actually, you hear that a lot among Russian commentators, that was a tactical thing. You ask for a lot and then you get something less, but the more you ask for, the better chance to get still quite a bit. So that's how they interpret it.
Yeah, I agree. About the most maximalist demands you could get. I wouldn't put them in the same degree as Austria, because basically Austria was asking Serbia to allow them to come in and take out people and to censor their press, and I don't think that's what Russia is saying. I think a lot of this is being driven by domestic politics in all three countries. The U.S. obviously has its problems. Boris Johnson is just in a something storm right now with problems. And we saw today Liz Truss in conversations with the Russian foreign minister was bellicose again, and Boris Johnson was bellicose again. One of the reasons I don't think Russia is going to do too much is because of its own domestic problems. The Russian economy is doing very poorly right now. And an invasion now would be very different than what came in 2014, where a lot of Russians were very supportive of the invasion in 2014. If something, especially a maximalist, the map's not there, a push towards Kyiv, I don't think there would be much stomach for that in Russia in the way there was taking Crimea in 2014. So I think, foreign policy is oftentimes directed, and particularly the speech of politicians is directed by domestic concerns as much as foreign concerns.
I have to push back about Russian economy because the gas and oil prices had been so astronomical, and I think it was Bloomberg yesterday or today that said that they expect this year so much extra, you know, billions, 300 billion.
125 a barrel. 125 a barrel.
So that even the sanctions will not be as effective because there's so much buffer will be this year. So I wouldn't say that.
Yeah, Russia has over $600 billion in hard currency reserves, you know, for this particular rainy day.
But they also have massive inflation right now.
That's true.
And their central bank is putting stops on their stock market, so I think they're concerned.
We now have time for 2 more questions.
Hi. I would like to ask about what options or what might be the options or measures that are left to Ukraine under these circumstances where few viable diplomatic solutions are left when Ukraine tries to respond to Putin's broad range of demands?
So just to clarify, so you're asking what are the diplomatic options for this?
Yes, left to Ukraine.
For Ukraine, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this a little bit already. One of the things that we didn't really talk a lot about, I think it was mentioned briefly, is revisiting the Minsk process, right? After 2014, discussions began in Minsk, in Belarus, and some people have suggested, Macron, for example, has suggested going back to that particular process. The problem there, though, is under that agreement, Ukraine would have to give a high degree of autonomy to the separatist regions in the Donbass. In exchange for the separatists laying down their arms and giving Ukraine back control of their border with Russia. But the problem from the Ukrainian point of view is they believe any effort to give autonomy or even something approaching autonomy or decentralization of power to that region would end up being a kind of a Trojan horse for Russian influence in Kyiv. And so Zelensky has been, to this point, given no indication that he's been willing to bend on that. Now, that could be just a public, a position that he's taking, but I think he is worried about what the implications would that be for politics in Kyiv, if he were to revert back to that process. So that's one possibility that's been discussed, but I'm not sure that that is going to be the way out.
And that agreement was so poorly written that autonomy, what is it? Right? Russia is reading autonomy as a separate police and judiciary and all kinds of other things in Donbass. Well, does that also mean representatives that would then sit in the Rada in Kyiv and then upset Kyiv's attempts to, move closer to the EU or something like that? So it was, again, really bad diplomacy. A very poorly written document that had no time frames, no implementation in it, and even the wording was so vague that both sides can say, you're the one that's preventing it from being done. So Ukraine's in a really bad position.
It is, but just needs to be mentioned that we have, I think, 2.5 million people, Russian-speaking, who do not participate in elections. So these people do not vote. So they do not participate in Ukrainian democracy, not allowed to participate in Ukrainian democracy, partly because it would significantly change the distribution of power between East and West. So it's, in a way, it is beneficial for Ukrainians or Ukrainian government not to include those people in democratic process.
Yeah, and the two governments disagree on how that should happen. So one side says, well, we can't allow them to vote until you pull out all your troops, and the other one says, well, we can't do it until. So again, I don't know what happens, because they're at complete loggerheads. They cannot agree even on the simplest of definitions. Yeah, that's a great point.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. I'm curious as to why we don't hear more about the prospect for creating an absolutely neutral Ukraine on the order of Finland, Sweden, Switzerland. Now, you'd have to have all sorts of diplomatic conversations concerning the people in Donetsk, Luhansk, and so forth, what their rights would be. But if you could do that, Russia would would have security, which is a valid concern, obviously. The Germans and the rest would be able to get Russian gas. The Russians would be able to sell it to them. Ukraine could trade with both countries. It seems to me a no-brainer if you could get it to work out. I'm wondering if this is just too naive.
No, I don't think it's naive. I agree with that. Now, the problem is going to be the Ukrainians aren't going to be happy with that.
Ukraine is the only country that has to decide it. No one else can impose a neutrality on it. So there are now voices suggesting that there needs to be a referendum in Ukraine for people to decide whether they want NATO, the prospect for NATO, or want neutrality. They can decide.
Well, but I mean, Ukraine, with respect to NATO, it's not up to Ukraine as to whether they will become members, right? Article 10, right? The so-called open door policy says that any European state who meets the requisite conditions can become a member of NATO, but the other members of NATO must unanimously agree to accept you, right? It's not as if Ukraine can knock on the door and say, I'm in.
But they have it in their constitution that we want to. Of course, they might not be taken if they want to.
But fine, they can want to all they want. Let me refer back to in the 1990s, former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry was and Perry was one of those in the 1990s who was a little bit skeptical about NATO enlargement. He was concerned, right, about, well, a couple of things, right? For one thing, NATO is a military alliance, not a social club, right? And so extending NATO to countries that weren't ready to integrate their militaries with NATO, for example. They weren't really ready to be members of the alliance. But he's having a conversation with somebody on the other side of the ledger pushing for NATO enlargement, and the other person is saying, and I can't remember who his interlocutor is here, but the other person is saying, but the Central Europeans really want in. And Perry's response was, but I'm not the Secretary of Defense for Poland. I am the Secretary of Defense for the United States, and I have to be concerned about American interests, not necessarily Polish interests or Ukrainian interests and so forth. So as far, I think, and in fact, this actually came up with Macron. Macron even mentioned the Finlandization option. For those of you who don't know, Finland, post-World War II, basically, had, control over its domestic political system, but had to be mindful of Russian interests when it came to their behavior in the foreign sphere. And I think that is a potentially viable option for Ukraine as well.
I would say, Ukraine has already signed a free trade agreement with the European Union. They've already moving to the West, towards the West, economically. So the Finlandization option would have to put the brakes on that for it to really work. And I don't think Ukrainians, particularly in Western Ukraine, are ready to do that. So it's a nice idea in theory to make Ukraine a buffer state, but it's if they have a desire to move towards the West, and they've already moving that way economically, it's kind of hard to stop that. But in sense of military alliance, I think Ukraine will be a buffer state. They're not going to be in NATO 100%. I don't think they're going to be in a military alliance with Russia. They just will be in this gray zone, right, for a long time.
Yeah, I think it is the best solution, but how do we make it happen? It's great because I think it would take care of a lot of Russia's concern about their strategic defense by preventing certainly preventing any further move to the east by NATO powers. But what do? Do you demilitarize all of Donetsk and Luhansk? Right? The Western Ukrainians are not going to like this, that they can't really determine themselves. Do we have to have permanently stationed peacekeepers? There'd have to be some kind of a security agreement, just in case Ukraine is invaded. The OSCE can only do so much. So it's a great idea, and I think it is the best idea, but getting it to work in the near term, I think this is a decade-long process at the very least.
I have an absurd solution. I would relocate people in those two republics into Russia and leave the land to Ukraine, because they don't really want people, they want the land. And we need people because we have all the land, so that would be the solution.
Can I just add one last comment along these lines? To the sort of the hawks on this issue, and I'm not talking about anybody on the panel, but you hear out there hardline position being articulated in the U.S. and the U.K. about, the need to defend Ukraine and the need to assert, NATO's prerogatives in that part of the world. I mean, the question I would ask those people is, what are you willing to do to put your money where your mouth is, right? The balance of capabilities and the balance of interest in Ukraine, I think, both rest with Russia. They have more at stake there. They have more capabilities in that region. So to those who would say, hardline, no compromise with what I argued before were legitimate Russian security interests, I would say to those people, what are you willing to do to back up that hard rhetoric, right? Are you willing to sacrifice, NATO lives? Are you willing to sacrifice NATO soldiers? Biden has already made it clear that he's not willing to do that. And so there comes a point where you have to ask, you either put up or shut up, right? Otherwise, at some point, your threats to sanction Russia, or that Russia will face, what's the language Biden is using, catastrophic consequences. I've yet to see what those catastrophic consequences are going to be.
Was it mother of all sanctions or something?
Mother of all
sanctions. Sanctions from the hell.
Yeah, there you go.
I want to make a personal comment about this panel. Before the panel, we got together and we mentioned, well, it'd be nice if we didn't all agree. And I find it refreshing to hear different voices, different views, voiced respectfully, and to take those into account. And hopefully it shows you how complicated this issue is. It is incredibly complex. There are no easy solutions. Nothing's going to get solved anytime soon. So stay tuned.
That concludes this evening's event. Please join me in thanking our panelists.